the fall of 2002, the city of Fort Collins, Colorado was shaken by a disappearance that would haunt the community for nearly 2 decades. Melissa Carter, a 29-year-old nurse and single mother, left her night shift at Poudre Valley Hospital just after 11 p.m. Friends expected her home, but she never arrived. She drove a red Jeep Cherokee. That car, and Melissa herself, seemed to vanish into the dark. The next morning, her mother tried to call, but the phone went unanswered. Melissa's 6-year-old son woke up alone in the house. By noon, the family reported her missing. Police began the search immediately. At first, investigators thought she might have run off, overwhelmed by stress. But those who knew Melissa rejected the idea. She loved her job. She loved her child. She had no reason to disappear. Then suspicions began to turn closer to home. Her boyfriend, David Turner, was the last person to see her. He told officers they argued that night. He claimed she stormed out and never returned. But his story changed more than once. Neighbors said they heard shouting from their house shortly before Melissa left. A friend later told police that Melissa had sounded nervous on the phone, as if she felt watched. Despite mounting suspicion, there was no body, no car, no weapon. The river that cut through Fort Collins, the Cache la Poudre, was searched from the banks, but no divers were deployed. Crucial opportunities slipped away. Months later, David Turner collected a $400,000 life insurance payout tied to Melissa's name. To her family, it looked like motive. To investigators, it was circumstantial. With no physical evidence, the case went cold. For years, Melissa's face appeared on missing person flyers and anniversary articles. Her mother held candlelight vigils by the river every November. Residents called the case the Poudre Mystery, a name that carried both fear and resignation. And for almost 18 years, that's all it was, a mystery with no answers. Until the summer of 2020, when a sonar scan of the river revealed a shape. Melissa Carter was 29 years old when she disappeared. She worked as a nurse at Poudre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. Her life was busy and demanding, but she carried herself with quiet strength. Colleagues described her as dependable, always willing to pick up extra shifts, often covering nights so others could spend time with their families. For Melissa, those hours meant more income to support her young son. She was a single mother, raising a 6-year-old boy on her own. Friends said he was her world. Every decision she made, every long night she worked, came back to him. She wanted to give him security and a chance at a better life. Despite exhaustion, Melissa never complained about the long hours. Her co-workers remembered her walking the hospital halls with tired eyes, but still offering a warm smile to patients. She was the kind of nurse who would stay after her shift if a patient needed comfort, one colleague later recalled. Outside of work, Melissa lived with her boyfriend, David Turner. David was 34, the owner of a small auto repair shop in town. He was known around Fort Collins, at least on the surface, as a hard-working man who ran a business and provided for his household. But behind closed doors, the picture was very different. Neighbors reported frequent arguments between Melissa and David. The fights often came late at night, loud enough that people next door could hear raised voices. Some described the shouting as explosive. Others said they occasionally heard doors slamming, things breaking, and Melissa crying. Despite the turmoil, she tried to keep the relationship stable for the sake of her son. Melissa's family and closest friends saw a different side. She confided in her mother and her best friend, Rachel Miller, about David's controlling behavior. He demanded to know where she was, who she spoke to, and accused her of being interested in other men. Melissa denied it, but the accusations never stopped. In the months leading up to her disappearance, she told Rachel more than once, "I feel like he's watching me. I don't feel safe." The tension in their household was growing. David often argued about money. He resented Melissa's late hours, suspecting she was hiding something from him. At least once, Melissa had considered moving out with her son. She wanted peace, but it wasn't easy. Finances, the difficulty of raising a child alone, and the hope that things might improve, kept her in the house with David longer than she probably should have stayed. Still, she kept trying to make it work. She brought home her paycheck, cooked meals, helped her son with schoolwork, and pretended to neighbors that life was ordinary. But behind her smile, there was fear. On the night before she vanished, Melissa had finished a grueling shift. It was late September of 2002, and she left the hospital parking lot close to midnight. Exhausted, she still picked up her phone and dialed Rachel. Her voice shook. "I think David is following me," she whispered. Rachel tried to calm her down, asking if she wanted to come over instead of driving home. Melissa said she just wanted to get back, but her words carried the edge of dread. That phone call would later become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. The next day, when Melissa failed to show up for her shift, colleagues knew something was wrong. She wasn't the type to skip work. More alarmingly, her young son was left waiting at preschool with no one. Friends and family never believed she would walk away voluntarily. She had a 6-year-old son. She had a stable job. She had close ties with her mother and friends. As one colleague said bluntly, Melissa wasn't the type to run. If she was gone, something happened to her. Her disappearance rattled the community. Nurses who had worked beside her organized vigils. Patients she had cared for came forward to speak about her kindness. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Nurse vanishes after night shift." The sense of shock deepened when neighbors confirmed years of arguments between Melissa and David. One recalled hearing him yell so loudly the night before she vanished that it shook the walls. But without a car, without a body, and without physical evidence, investigators had no foundation to charge him. They could not prove what happened. The case stalled. Rumors spread in Fort Collins. Some said Melissa had simply run away from the pressure of single motherhood. Others believed David had finally gone too far. For her family, the pain was endless. Her mother kept calling the police, begging for updates. Her son asked questions no one could answer. Rachel, the best friend who had spoken to her just before she vanished, carried the weight of that final call for years. In the official record, Melissa's case became one of many unsolved disappearances. Detectives listed her as a missing adult with suspicious circumstances. But as months turned into years, the file was moved into the cold case drawer. Melissa's life, though brief, left a deep mark on those around her. She was remembered as a woman who worked tirelessly, who loved her son, who tried to navigate a troubled relationship, and who voiced her fears just hours before she vanished. Her disappearance was not only a mystery, it was a wound for her family, her friends, and her community. The questions remained. What happened when she left the hospital that night? Was David truly following her as she feared? And if so, where did her journey end? Those questions would linger for nearly 2 decades. They formed the foundation of one of the most haunting mysteries in Colorado history. Part 2 ends with those September 12th, 2002. A routine night in Fort Collins turned into the beginning of an 18-year mystery. Melissa Carter finished her shift at Poudre Valley Hospital a few minutes before midnight. She had worked a long double, a demanding schedule she often took to provide for her 6-year-old son. At 11:45 p.m., hospital security cameras recorded her walking across the dimly lit parking lot. She wore her nursing scrubs, carried a large purse, and had her light jacket draped over one arm. In the footage, she unlocked her red Jeep Cherokee, climbing inside, and drove out of the lot. Nothing in her appearance suggested she was about to vanish forever. Just 5 minutes later, Melissa placed a phone call that would become one of the most haunting pieces of the case. At 11:50 p.m., she called her best friend, Rachel Miller. Rachel later told police that Melissa's voice was shaky, almost whispering. Melissa said, "I think David is following me." David Turner, her boyfriend, had a history of controlling behavior, and Melissa had confided before that she sometimes felt trapped. Rachel urged her to come directly to her house. It was only a 15-minute drive away. Melissa hesitated and told her friend she needed to go home first because her son was sleeping there. That was the last conversation anyone ever had with her. Around 12:05 a.m., a traffic camera captured a red Jeep traveling north through Fort Collins. Investigators later matched the blurry image to Melissa's vehicle. At nearly the same time, a truck driver on Route 14 reported seeing a Jeep speeding toward the Cache la Poudre River. He recalled it because red SUVs were not common in that stretch at night. His statement aligned almost perfectly with the timeline already on record. At 12:10 a.m., Melissa's cell phone went silent. Cell tower logs showed her phone had been active until that moment. Then abruptly, the signal stopped. Investigators later confirmed there were no further pings, no outgoing messages, no attempts to connect. Experts determined the device was either powered off manually or destroyed. The tower triangulation placed the last known location near the Poudre River corridor. The sudden silence marked the final trace of her movements. By dawn, the first signs of something wrong began to unfold. Melissa was scheduled for another hospital shift early that morning. She had never missed work without calling in. When she did not appear by 7 a.m., colleagues called her phone repeatedly. There was no answer. At 9 a.m., her son's preschool called her family. He had not been picked up, and no one had heard from his mother. For Melissa's relatives, this was the breaking point. At 10 a.m., her mother and sister phoned the Fort Collins Police Department to file a missing person report. They explained that Melissa had vanished after her night shift. Her child had been left unattended, and she had not contacted anyone. Detectives immediately categorized it as suspicious. They noted she had no history of leaving voluntarily, no debts, no sudden travel plans. This was not the pattern of someone walking away. The first person investigators turned to was David Turner. When questioned, David admitted that he and Melissa had argued the evening before she disappeared. He told police she had stormed out to get some air and might have left town on her own. His version quickly clashed with the security footage from the hospital. Melissa was still at work when David claimed she had already left. That contradiction raised alarms. David also suggested Melissa had texted him around midnight saying she needed space. Police examined his. Meanwhile, detectives focused on the Jeep Cherokee. By noon on September 13th, patrol units had canvassed the city, highways, and nearby lots. No red Jeep matching Melissa's description appeared anywhere. Police issued a statewide BOLO. Still, there was no trace. The disappearance of both Melissa and her vehicle became the central riddle. Cars do not simply vanish, yet this one had. As the hours turned into days, more witnesses surfaced. Several neighbors reported hearing loud arguments at the Carter-Turner residence in the weeks leading up to September 12th. One neighbor told police that on the night in question he saw David in his backyard unusually late, pacing, appearing agitated. Though not direct evidence, the statement added to suspicion. Rachel Miller repeated her account to detectives, describing Melissa's fearful tone on the phone. She stressed that her friend sounded terrified. This detail, combined with the missing Jeep and David's inconsistent story, painted a grim picture. Still, investigators lacked hard evidence. No crime scene, no body, no vehicle. Without those, they could not charge anyone. In the early days of the search, police concentrated on the Cache la Poudre River. Search teams, dogs, and boats combed miles of shoreline. Nothing surfaced. The river was deep, fast, and murky in September. If a vehicle had gone in, it could easily have sunk out of sight. But without technology advanced enough to probe beneath layers of silt, the Jeep remained hidden. Family members continued to insist Melissa would never abandon her child. Her mother told detectives she would not leave him for an hour, let alone vanish without a word. That conviction kept pressure on authorities. Yet as days stretched into weeks, leads dried up. David Turner cooperated just enough to avoid arrest. He attended interviews, repeated his story, and portrayed himself as a concerned partner. Behind the scenes, detectives noted his demeanor was cold and detached. They suspected him strongly, but lacked evidence to prove involvement. By late September, the case hit a wall. No sightings of the Jeep, no credible reports of Melissa elsewhere. No financial activity, no phone calls, no paper trail. The official timeline ended at 12:10 a.m. when Melissa's phone died. Everything after that was a void. No trace of her Jeep, no further witnesses, no sign of Melissa herself. That blank space defined the case for nearly 2 decades. This chapter of the story leaves a chilling picture. A hard-working young mother finished her shift, drove into the night, spoke words of fear to her friend, and then was erased from the map. Every piece of evidence pointed to danger. None of it revealed her fate. The unanswered questions piled up. Where was the Jeep? Why had David lied about her movements? And what really happened along the Poudre River just after midnight? These gaps set the stage for the next part of the story. Part 4 will explore the investigation that followed, the missteps, the overlooked leads, and the mounting suspicion around David Turner. It was in those early days that crucial opportunities were missed, allowing the case to slip into cold storage for nearly 18 years. When Melissa Carter was officially reported missing on the morning of September 12, 2002, the Fort Collins Police Department treated the case as a high-risk disappearance. She was a young mother, a nurse who had never skipped a shift without notice, and her 6-year-old son had been left unattended at school. For detectives, those were immediate red flags. The case file was marked Endangered Missing Person, and within hours search teams were mobilized. The initial focus was the Cache la Poudre River. It was the last known direction of travel for Melissa's red Jeep Cherokee, spotted by a truck driver shortly after midnight. Search dogs were brought in. Divers were deployed into the cold, fast-moving water. Helicopters scanned the area from above. But the river was deceptive, its current strong, its bends deep, and its bed filled with layers of silt and debris. The Jeep could have been hidden anywhere beneath the surface, invisible to the naked eye and unreachable by standard equipment in 2002. Days of searching produced nothing, no car, no trace of Melissa. Attention quickly turned back to Melissa's home life. Investigators sat down with her boyfriend, David Turner. In his first statement, David claimed that Melissa had left the house after a heated argument. According to him, she had stormed. When confronted, David adjusted his version. He now said Melissa had returned home briefly, that they argued again, and that she sent him a message saying she was leaving Fort Collins for good. But investigators could find no record of that message. Melissa's phone activity stopped cold at 12:10 a.m. near the river. There were no text records, no follow-up calls. The inconsistency made David look suspicious from the very beginning. Then came an anonymous tip. A letter arrived at the Fort Collins Police Department, typed on plain paper with no return address. It claimed that David was deeply in debt from gambling and owed money to dangerous people. She knew too much. He had to make a choice, the letter read. Detectives noted the allegation but couldn't confirm it. There was no signature, no way to trace the sender, and no evidence to support the theory. Still, it raised another angle: money. Financial investigators began looking into David's records. What they discovered only deepened suspicion. Melissa had taken out a life insurance policy not long before she disappeared, naming David as the beneficiary. Within months of her vanishing, David filed a claim and collected nearly $400,000. To Melissa's family, the timing was damning. Her mother told a reporter, "Who cashes in their partner's insurance while she's still missing? Unless they already know she isn't coming back." Detectives made the same note in their reports. The possibility of financial motive was now squarely on the table. But suspicion wasn't enough. Without a car, without a body, without a crime scene, prosecutors had no way to build charges. The investigation dragged on. Detectives canvassed Fort Collins, knocking on doors, speaking to neighbors and co-workers. Many confirmed that Melissa had confided in them about her troubled relationship. Several neighbors reported loud arguments from the house she shared with David. One said she often heard Melissa crying on the back porch late at night. Another recalled seeing David outside around midnight on the night Melissa disappeared, pacing in the yard, looking nervous. The problem was that none of these statements provided physical proof. They painted a picture, but they didn't prove a crime. Inside the investigation, mistakes began to pile up. Detectives failed to seize David's phone in the first critical days. By the time they did, any potential evidence, deleted messages, call logs, or location data, was long gone. They also delayed seeking a warrant to freeze his bank accounts. By the time the paperwork was filed, most of the insurance payout had already been moved. Those early lapses would haunt the case for years. Melissa's family never let up. Her mother and sister called detectives constantly, pressing for updates, demanding searches, and asking for federal involvement. When official leads dried up, they organized their own searches. Volunteers combed rural roads and riverbanks. Flyers were mailed to towns across Colorado. The family held prayer circles and vigils each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, refusing to let her name fade from memory. Rachel Miller, Melissa's closest friend, told reporters that she had spoken with Melissa less than 20 minutes before she vanished. In that call, Melissa sounded frightened. She said, "I think David is following me." For Rachel, it was chilling proof that Melissa felt endangered in her final moments. She repeated the statement again and again to investigators, hoping it would push them toward David. But the lack of physical evidence kept the case stalled. By early 2003, the file sat heavier and heavier on the shelves of the Fort Collins Police Department. Detectives rotated off the case, leads were exhausted. Without a body, a vehicle, or forensic evidence, the district attorney's office refused to move forward. As one detective later admitted, "We knew where the evidence pointed, but we couldn't take it to court." Months turned into years. The Jeep remained missing. Melissa remained missing. David lived openly in Fort Collins, running his auto repair shop, spending the insurance money, and presenting himself as a free man. Every time her family drove past his business, they felt a wave of anger. They were convinced he was guilty, yet the law had done nothing. The community's initial shock dulled into resignation. Melissa became... Yet, through it all, Melissa's family refused to let the case be forgotten. They attended city council meetings, urging leaders to allocate more resources to unsolved crimes. They spoke to journalists. They kept Melissa's picture in the local paper on anniversaries. And every September, they gathered by the river with candles, hoping for a break that never came. By the 10th anniversary, in 2012, Melissa's disappearance was one of Fort Collins' longest-running mysteries. Detectives who had worked the original investigation admitted they still thought about it, still believed David Turner knew more than he ever admitted. But belief wasn't enough. The early investigation had laid out pieces of the puzzle. Melissa's fear, expressed in her last phone call, the Jeep heading toward the river, David's shifting alibis, the suspicious insurance payout. But the biggest piece, the physical evidence, was missing. That absence crippled the case. 18 years would pass before technology finally revealed what the river had hidden. Until then, Melissa's story remained suspended in limbo. The initial investigation closed not with answers, but with silence. A mother vanished, a community divided, a suspect walking free, and a family forced to live every day with the question, would they ever know the truth? The case was officially shelved as a cold file, but Melissa's family never stopped pressing. Their persistence kept the file alive, waiting for the day when new technology could break it open. And that sets the stage for the next chapter. Because while investigators struggled and faltered in 2002, the river still held its secret. In Part 5, we'll explore the long, cold years that followed, the vigils, the fading leads, the rumors, and the unshakable determination of a family who refused to let Melissa's name disappear. The fall of 2002 faded into winter, and Melissa Carter's disappearance was no closer to being solved. Police in Fort Collins had followed every visible lead. They searched the riverbanks, canvassed neighborhoods, and questioned dozens of... Melissa's mother refused to let the case die. Every September, on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she and her other daughter gathered at the banks of the Cache la Poudre River. They lit candles, prayed, and invited neighbors to join them. They printed flyers year after year. Bright posters with Melissa's face were taped to telephone poles, pinned to bulletin boards, and even mailed to towns across Colorado and into Wyoming. Each flyer carried the same line: "Someone knows something. Please come forward." Her sister wrote letters to local newspapers. She appeared on community radio shows. She begged the public not to forget. Even as time stretched on, the family never gave up. Melissa's son was only 6 when she vanished. He grew up without answers, surrounded by whispers. Classmates would ask him, "Where's your mom?" He had no reply. Teachers and counselors tried to comfort him, but the wound never healed. Family members worried about the toll. They told him again and again, "One day the truth will come out." But year after year, nothing changed. By the time he was a teenager, he carried a mix of anger and sorrow. His mother's picture remained framed on the wall, a constant reminder of a story without an ending. Every few years, a new detective inherited the Carter file. In 2005, the case was reviewed again. No new evidence. In 2010, another team looked at it. Same result. In 2015, a veteran detective took one last swing before retirement. He later admitted, "We always looked at David Turner, but we had nothing we could bring to court." The file grew thicker with notes, but thinner with hope. Fort Collins residents filled the silence with speculation. Some believed Melissa had run away. They argued that she was under stress, working long hours, raising a child, and enduring fights with David. Maybe she had packed up and disappeared. Others dismissed that idea outright. Melissa loved her son. She would never abandon him. These voices were convinced that David had done something to her and hidden the truth. But without the car, without a body, the theory remained just that: suspicion. Local newspapers began calling it the Poudre River Mystery. Between 2006 and 2015, public attention faded. The case slipped from headlines. New tragedies filled the news cycle. At church vigils and small-town gatherings, Melissa's name was still whispered, but the urgency had dulled. Many believed the case was simply unsolvable. Even so, the annual candlelight vigils continued. Dozens would gather by the river each year, holding pictures, bowing their heads, and promising not to forget. Melissa's mother never stopped writing letters. She mailed them to police chiefs, governors, and even the FBI. She demanded answers. She demanded action. Her sister pushed the story onto television. Cold case shows picked up the mystery, giving it a second life. Audiences across Colorado heard the name Melissa Carter again. The family's persistence kept the case alive even when official interest had nearly vanished. By 2020, almost 18 years had passed. The Carter file was still stamped unsolved. But science had changed. Law enforcement now had access to sonar mapping, underwater radar, and advanced DNA testing that didn't exist in 2002. Melissa's family submitted another petition. They pleaded for the Fort Collins Cold Case Unit to apply the new technology. This time, they got a different answer. Detectives agreed to search again. They would scan the Cache la Poudre River, the same place where a truck driver had seen a red Jeep nearly 2 decades earlier. For nearly 18 years, the case of Melissa Carter remained frozen. The family never stopped pushing. The community never fully healed. And the police, haunted by their own missteps, waited for a chance to redeem themselves. The question lingered. Could technology finally succeed where people had failed? In Part 6, we turn to 2020. Sonar teams entered the river searching the depths. And there, beneath layers of mud and water, they found what had been hidden since 2002. The discovery of the Jeep Cherokee would change everything. By 2020, nearly 2 decades had passed since the disappearance of Melissa Carter. The task force began by reviewing everything: old reports, forgotten photographs, and scattered witness statements. Once again, the same unanswered questions surfaced. What had happened to Melissa and her red Jeep Cherokee? The absence of the vehicle had always been the biggest gap. It was as if both the woman and her car had been erased from the face of the earth. Rodriguez suggested something that had been impossible in 2002. Use sonar and radar to scan the riverbed of the Cache la Poudre. The idea wasn't new. Families of missing persons had pushed for underwater searches for years. But the technology available back then couldn't penetrate the thick layers of silt and debris. Now, with high-frequency sonar and 3D radar mapping, investigators could see beneath the mud with astonishing clarity. The decision was made. In July 2020, the search team assembled by the river. Technicians lowered equipment into the water, sending pulses across the current. Family members stood on the bank, clutching each other's hands. Rodriguez kept his eyes fixed on the monitor, knowing that this moment could decide whether the case remained cold or finally cracked open. Hours passed. The sonar swept back and forth. Then, around 50 meters from shore, the screen lit up. A large rectangular object appeared, half buried in the riverbed. The outline was faint but unmistakable, an SUV. The dimensions were nearly identical to a Jeep Cherokee. Rodriguez felt his heart pound. After 18 years, they had found something real. Divers were called in. The current was strong and the riverbed treacherous, covered in stones and thick layers of mud. It took hours of digging and careful maneuvering before the outline of metal emerged from the darkness. Slowly, piece by piece, the object revealed itself. And then, there it was. A red Jeep Cherokee, still bearing a rusted Colorado plate that matched Melissa's registration. When the vehicle broke the surface, water poured out of shattered windows. The paint was corroded, the body twisted, but it was intact. Family members collapsed into tears. They had waited nearly 2 decades for this sight, both dreading and praying for it. The discovery confirmed what they had feared all along. Melissa had not left voluntarily. She and her car had been deliberately hidden. The Jeep was towed to a secure forensic facility. Investigators treated it as a crime scene frozen in time. Inside, they found Melissa's black leather purse, containing her driver's license, credit cards, and small personal items. Her nurse's uniform was folded in the back seat, still recognizable, though water-damaged. Her hospital ID card lay wedged between the seats. Most chilling was the evidence of violence. On the driver's seat, faint but detectable traces of dried blood remained. Swabs were taken immediately. In the trunk, they collected fabric fibers and a partial fingerprint pressed into the metal of the spare tire compartment. It didn't match Melissa. The samples went to the state crime lab. Within weeks, results came back. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Melissa Carter. More than that, David Turner's DNA was present on both the steering wheel and inside the trunk. For years, David had insisted he hadn't seen Melissa the night she vanished. He claimed she left after an argument. But the evidence said otherwise. Even more intriguing, analysts found a second, unidentified DNA profile on Melissa's jacket, recovered from the passenger side of the Jeep. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't David's. Forensic scientists preserved the sample for comparison. For the first time, investigators had proof that another person might have been present that night. Rodriguez and the task force dug deeper. They reopened financial records from 2002, this time using modern digital tools to track money flow. What they uncovered was damning. Just days after Melissa disappeared, David Turner transferred $50,000 to his longtime friend, Mark Reynolds. The transaction had been noted in passing years ago, but dismissed as a personal loan. In 2020, with suspicion already mounting, it looked very different. Why would David pay such a large sum immediately after Melissa vanished? Further investigation revealed Reynolds had been near the Cache la Poudre the very night Melissa disappeared. A witness from years earlier remembered seeing him at a gas station close to the river. Back then, no one followed up. Now, paired with the financial transfer, the connection was undeniable. The FBI stepped in. With potential insurance fraud, money transfers, and cross-state financial activity, federal jurisdiction applied. FBI agents interviewed Reynolds, digging into his alibis. They also reviewed Turner's insurance claims. David had collected $400,000 in life insurance money just months after Melissa's disappearance. Money he wasn't legally entitled to claim without proof of death. But somehow he had managed to secure it. The timing of the payout, combined with the transfer to Reynolds, suggested coordination. By the fall of 2020, the case had shifted from whispers to community members who had once speculated she ran away were forced to confront the facts. David Turner, a man who ran a business in town and presented himself as a caring partner, was no longer just suspicious. He was tied to the crime scene by science. Rodriguez later said it was the most powerful moment of his career. Watching the Jeep emerge from the river was like watching history surface. "We didn't just pull out a car," he explained. "We pulled out the truth that had been buried for 18 years. By November 2020, the task force had compiled a strong case. They presented their findings to the district attorney. Forensic reports, financial records, witness interviews, and Reynolds' suspicious role. Prosecutors agreed. It was time to act. The FBI worked with local police to draft 2 arrest warrants. One for David Turner, charging him with second-degree murder and insurance fraud. The other for Mark Reynolds, charging him with evidence tampering and conspiracy. The family of Melissa Carter was informed first. They gathered in their living room, tears in their eyes, as Rodriguez explained the next steps. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, there would finally be accountability. In December 2020, the quiet suburban life of Fort Collins was shaken. Police cars lined up outside David Turner's home. Neighbors came to their windows, stunned as officers approached the front door. When David stepped outside, he was placed in handcuffs. For years, many had suspected him. Now they watched their suspicions confirmed in real time. At the same time, Reynolds was arrested at his small house on the edge of town. He looked defeated, as if the weight of the past 18 years had finally crushed him. Both men were taken into custody. The arrests were the culmination of nearly 20 years of persistence, technology, and a family's refusal to give up. What had once seemed like an impossible mystery was now moving toward justice. But this was only the beginning. With the suspects in custody, the focus turned to the courtroom, where the evidence would be tested and the truth laid bare. December 2020. Nearly 2 decades after Melissa Carter vanished, Fort Collins woke to a scene no one ever expected to witness. Before sunrise, unmarked SUVs rolled quietly into a quiet residential neighborhood on the east side of town. Armed officers from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, backed by FBI agents, fanned out across the block. Their mission was clear: execute an arrest warrant for David Turner, the man long suspected of being at the center of Melissa's disappearance. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as flashing lights filled the street. The silence of the morning was broken by the sound of boots on pavement and officers shouting commands. Within minutes, David Turner stepped out onto the porch of his modest home. He wore a sweatshirt and jeans, his expression pale but composed. He looked around at the officers, at the cameras already arriving, and at the neighbors whispering in shock. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The charge was read aloud: second-degree murder in connection with the death of Melissa Carter. Added to that was insurance fraud tied to the $400,000 policy Melissa had taken out shortly before she vanished. Some neighbors gasped as the words echoed across the street. Many had known David for years. They had hired him to fix their cars, shared coffee with him at the local diner, even trusted him to pick up their kids when schedules got busy. To them, he had been part of the fabric of the community. The idea that he could be accused of killing the woman he once lived with was almost too much to process. One neighbor later told a reporter, "That morning, everything changed." Mark opened the door in shock as officers rushed forward. He did not resist. Within minutes, he too was in handcuffs. The charges: accessory to murder, destruction of evidence, and unlawful financial gain. Neighbors gathered on the lawn as police escorted Mark away. "He was quiet, polite," one woman said. "We never thought he could be part of something like this." The arrests hit the community like a thunderclap. For years, Fort Collins had lived with the unresolved pain of Melissa Carter's disappearance. Some believed she had run away. Others were certain David Turner had killed her, even if no proof had ever surfaced. But as news spread that the Jeep Cherokee had been found at the bottom of the Cache la Poudre River, and that DNA evidence tied David to the vehicle, the whispers turned into certainty. The revelation that Mark Reynolds had been involved only deepened the shock. A man who had stood in the background of David's life was now accused of helping conceal the crime. Within hours, television crews crowded the streets, broadcasting live images of the arrests across Colorado and the nation. Reporters called it one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in decades. Headlines splashed across newspapers: "Arrests made in 2002 Poudre River Mystery." For the Carter family, the news was overwhelming. Melissa's mother broke down in tears when detectives called with confirmation. Her words were simple, but heavy. "We've waited so long. Now, finally, maybe the truth will be heard." Melissa's son, now 24 years old, released a statement through the family. He wrote, "For nearly 20 years, I have lived without answers. Today I feel like my mom's voice is finally being heard. This is the first step toward justice." The arrests reignited a storm of emotions in Fort Collins. Some residents said they had always suspected David Turner. "He was too calm, too collected back then," one man recalled. Others refused to believe the accusations. "He was a good man, a father." Investigators doubted the full truth of his story, but his admission gave them what they needed: corroboration that David had not acted alone, and that the Jeep's presence in the river was no coincidence. The community was shaken. A crime that had once seemed impossible to solve was suddenly alive again. But the arrests also raised new questions. If David was guilty, why had he chosen to live openly for so many years? If Mark had confessed, what else was he hiding? And what about the unidentified DNA found on Melissa's clothing? As the news cycle exploded, Fort Collins found itself at the center of national attention. Journalists descended on the city, setting up live broadcasts in front of the courthouse and outside the Carter family home. True crime programs dissected every detail, from the sonar technology that revealed the Jeep to the financial record showing David's sudden wealth after Melissa's disappearance. The phrase, Poudre River Mystery, returned to headlines, now with a new chapter. Arrests, confessions, and the promise of a trial that would finally bring answers. The arrests of David Turner and Mark Reynolds did not just stir Fort Collins. They triggered a wave of emotion across Colorado and beyond. For nearly 2 decades, the case had hung like a shadow, an unanswered question whispered in diners, classrooms, and church halls. Now, with handcuffs on David and Mark, those whispers erupted into arguments, debates, and raw emotion. On Main Street, people stopped strangers to talk about it. At grocery stores, in barber shops, at school pickup lines, the name Melissa Carter returned to everyday conversation. Some said the arrests confirmed what they had always believed. David was guilty, and the evidence had finally caught up to him. Others shook their heads, refusing to accept that a man they had trusted with their cars, their money, even their friendship, could have done something so dark. The divide was sharp. "I always told my husband there was something off about David," one woman recalled to a reporter. "He was too quick to move on after Melissa vanished." And the insurance money? That was the red flag, another resident disagreed. "David helped me out." The attention wasn't just about Melissa's story, it was also about technology. Reporters highlighted how sonar and forensic DNA had succeeded where earlier investigations failed. Headlines framed it as a case study in how science could deliver justice even after decades of silence. But amid the headlines and broadcasts, the Carter family remained grounded in grief. Melissa's mother spoke briefly to the press. Her voice cracked as she said, "We prayed for this day, but it doesn't erase the years we lived without her." Her grandson, Melissa's son, refused most interviews. But when cornered by a camera on his way to work, he said softly, "This isn't a victory. It's just the truth finally being told." In Fort Collins, a candlelight vigil was organized within days of the arrests. Hundreds gathered near the riverbank where the Jeep had been recovered. They carried signs reading, "Justice for Melissa," and "Never Forgotten." Some wept openly. Others stood silently, holding candles against the cold night air. The community that once doubted now united, at least in grief, even if not all agreed on guilt. Inside the Larimer County Jail, David Turner remained defiant. During his initial hearings, he shook his head as charges were read. His lawyer repeated a single theme: without a body, the case was circumstantial. In a statement to the press, David declared, "I did not kill Melissa Carter. The prosecutors are trying to frame me with half-truths and lies." But outside those walls, the tide of public opinion shifted heavily against him. The DNA in the Jeep, the suspicious insurance payout, and now Mark Reynolds' confession painted a picture that was hard for most to dismiss. Even those who once defended David found it difficult to explain away the growing evidence. Mark, meanwhile, was cracking under the weight of guilt. Reports from law enforcement said he wept during interrogations, admitting he had stood beside David on that dark night in 2002. He claimed David insisted Melissa's death was an accident, but when pressed, Mark faltered. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he told detectives. "I just know I pushed that Jeep into the river." The confession spread quickly, further fueling public outrage. Editorial: For the Carter family, the arrests were only the beginning of another long journey. The trial. They knew justice was not guaranteed. Prosecutors would need to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt, despite the absence of Melissa's body. The looming question of the unidentified DNA remained another complication. Still, the sense of momentum was undeniable. What had once been considered unsolvable now felt within reach. Families from across Colorado who had lost loved ones in cold cases wrote letters to the Carters, offering support and hope. Some even attended the vigils, saying, "Your fight gives us courage for our own battles." The emotional storm swept into every corner of Fort Collins. Teachers addressed the case in classrooms when students asked questions. Churches held prayer services. Local businesses raised money for the Carter family's legal fund. For a city once divided, the arrests became a rallying point, though not everyone stood on the same side. As weeks passed, the community's focus shifted toward what lay ahead: the courtroom. The arrest was a milestone, but the trial would determine whether justice was more than just an accusation. Residents asked the same question at coffee shops and dinner tables. Would David Turner finally be held accountable? Or would another chapter of doubt haunt them? As the weeks passed, the spectacle of David Turner's arrest began to fade from the nightly news cycle. But the real story was only beginning. Inside the Larimer County Jail, David tried to maintain a front of control, yet cracks in his composure began to show. Guards described him as argumentative, often pacing his cell, muttering about conspiracies and corrupt prosecutors. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney from Denver, advised silence. But David insisted on writing letters, some to his family, others to local papers, proclaiming his innocence. "This is a witch hunt," one letter read. "I loved Melissa. I never hurt her. They're using me as a scapegoat for their failures." For many, his words rang hollow. Too many years of suspicion, too many inconsistencies in his stories. And most damning of all, the physical evidence recovered from the Jeep seemed impossible to deny. Yet David's persistence fed. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds faced his own demons. In his first nights in custody, he refused food and sat silently through questioning. But within days, his defenses crumbled. He told investigators he had been manipulated, pressured by David into helping cover up a terrible situation. He insisted he had no knowledge of Melissa's fate until that night by the river. "He called me. He sounded panicked," Mark said. "When I got there, she was gone. He just kept saying we had to get rid of the Jeep. I didn't know what else to do." His partial cooperation put him in a fragile position. Prosecutors considered offering a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. But they also knew Mark's credibility would be attacked by David's defense team. A liar, a coward, a desperate man saying anything to save himself. Those were the words David's lawyer was already preparing. Still, Mark's confession provided a narrative that prosecutors could use to build their case. For Melissa's family, the developments were bittersweet. Relief at progress was tempered by the pain of reliving old wounds. Melissa's mother told a local station, "I see his face on TV in handcuffs and I think, Why did it take 18 years? Why did my grandson have to grow up without answers? Her voice trembled, but her resolve was clear. We will be in that courtroom every day until justice is served. Melissa's son, now in his mid-20s, spoke at a community vigil. His words carried the weight of nearly 2 decades without a mother. I was 6 when she disappeared. I barely remember her voice. I grew up with questions no child should have to answer. But today I stand here knowing the truth is closer than ever. I will not stop until we finish this. The crowd applauded, some wiping away tears. The case had become more than just a local tragedy. It was a national conversation. Legal analysts appeared on television to debate the challenges of prosecuting a murder without a body. Some argued the DNA and financial evidence were overwhelming. Others cautioned that juries were unpredictable, especially when the defense could point. Inside the community, the case was personal. Teachers remembered Melissa as the mother who always volunteered at her son's school. Patients from the hospital recalled her kindness on long nights. Friends shared stories of laughter and resilience, reminding people she was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman with dreams. As the days ticked down to trial, tensions rose. Would David's charm and claims of innocence sway a jury? Would Mark's testimony hold up under the fierce scrutiny of cross-examination? Would Melissa's family finally get the closure they had fought for? Or would the courtroom battle reopen wounds too deep to heal? On the eve of the trial, one headline in the Denver Post summed up the mood. 18 years of silence end in courtroom showdown. Fort Collins braced for answers. The Carter family prepared for a fight that had consumed nearly 2 decades of their lives. Spring 2021. The courthouse in Larimer County, Colorado was packed before sunrise. News trucks lined the street. Reporters held microphones waiting for even the smallest glimpse of the 2 men at the center of one of the state's most notorious cold cases. Nearly 20 years after Melissa Carter vanished, the question of who was responsible was finally going to be answered in court. Inside, every seat was filled. Some people had traveled hours to be there. Others had followed the story since 2002 and wanted to see the ending with their own eyes. On the front row sat Melissa's family. Her mother clutched a tissue in one hand. Her son, now a young man of 24, sat beside her, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists. They had waited almost 2 decades for this moment. At exactly 9 o'clock, the judge entered. The room stood in silence. Moments later, the deputies led David Turner into the courtroom. He wore a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression stone cold. He walked with deliberate steps, as if trying to show control. But his eyes, darting around the room, betrayed the tension beneath his calm facade. Across the room, the second defendant, Mark Reynolds, was seated separately. His trial would be handled on a different track, but today this case is about betrayal. Melissa Carter was not a runaway. She was not a woman who simply vanished into the night. She was a devoted mother, a nurse, and a daughter who deserved to live. The defendant, David Turner, wanted her gone. He wanted her life insurance money, and he wanted control. The evidence will show he orchestrated her death, and with the help of his friend, Mark Reynolds, he hid her Jeep at the bottom of the Poudre River for nearly 20 years. The words hung heavy in the air. Some jurors nodded slowly. Others kept their eyes fixed on David. The defense responded with a very different tone. David's attorney walked confidently to the jury box, his voice measured, almost soothing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a murder trial. This is a case built on assumptions, on half-truths, and on desperation. There is no body. There is no cause of death. The prosecution wants you to believe a story that cannot be proven. And remember this. Another man's DNA was found on Melissa's jacket. That evidence, unexplained, is proof that the state's theory is incomplete. My client, David Turner, is not guilty." The line about "no body, no cause of death" would be repeated again and again throughout the trial. It was the cornerstone of David's defense. The first witnesses were called. A middle-aged woman, a neighbor from Fort Collins, took the stand. She recalled the night in 2002 when she heard shouting coming from the Carter Turner house. "It wasn't the first time," she said softly. "But that night it sounded worse. I remember thinking, something bad is going to happen." Her testimony gave the jury a picture of a relationship filled with violence and volatility. Then came Rachel Miller, Melissa's closest friend. She walked to the witness stand carrying a piece of paper in her hand. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. "She called me that night. Around midnight. She sounded scared. She said, 'Rachel, I think David is—'" The prosecution ended the first day by showing jurors photographs of the Jeep being pulled from the river in 2020. The images of the mud-stained vehicle, the rusted license plate still bearing Melissa's numbers, were displayed on a large screen. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The Jeep was no longer just evidence. It was a silent witness that had waited underwater for nearly 2 decades. The judge adjourned for the evening, but the atmosphere did not fade. People walked out of the courthouse whispering, shaking their heads. For the family of Melissa Carter, the trial was only beginning. But already, the truth felt closer than it had ever been. Day 2 of the trial focused on the physical evidence. The prosecution called forensic specialists who had worked on the Jeep after it was pulled from the Cache la Poudre River in 2020. The first expert was a DNA analyst from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. She described the painstaking process of extracting samples from the waterlogged vehicle. Despite nearly 2 decades underwater, we recovered viable DNA. On the steering wheel and the gearshift, we found profiles belonging to David Turner. These were not trace amounts. They were strong, consistent matches. The prosecutor asked her to clarify the significance. "In simple terms," the analyst said, "the person whose DNA we recovered was operating that vehicle, and the DNA belonged to David Turner." Jurors scribbled notes. Some leaned back, absorbing the weight of her statement. The defense attorney countered. On cross-examination, he pressed the analyst. "Is it unusual to find a boyfriend's DNA in his partner's car?" "No," she admitted. "Not unusual at all." The defense leaned on this point, arguing that David often drove Melissa's Jeep, which explained his DNA. But then the prosecution pivoted. A second forensic expert took the stand, this one focusing on blood evidence. He described finding dried stains on the driver's seat cushion. "We tested the samples. They matched Melissa Carter's DNA." The room tightened with tension. The expert added that the blood pattern suggested injury, not a simple cut or nosebleed. Combined with the vehicle's hidden condition, the implication was clear. This was not an accident. Then came the most disturbing detail. In the trunk, investigators found fibers and a partial palm print. The fibers didn't match Melissa's clothing. The print didn't belong to her either. Did the palm print match David Turner? The prosecutor asked. No. It matched Mark Reynolds. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The jury looked at Mark, seated on the other side of the room, pale and trembling. With this, the stage was set for his testimony. When Mark was called to the stand, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. He walked slowly, avoiding David's gaze. His hands shook as he was sworn in. At first his voice was quiet, barely audible, but as questioning continued, the dam broke. He described the phone call he received from David around midnight in September 2002. David sounded frantic. He told me to come over right away. He said Melissa wouldn't be coming back. I didn't understand at first. When I got there, she wasn't in the house. He told me we had to take care of the Jeep. Mark's words came haltingly. He admitted helping David drive the Jeep toward the river. They pushed it down a slope into the water, watching it sink beneath the current. I asked him what happened. Mark said. He just told me, don't ask questions. She's gone. The prosecutor pressed. Did he pay you for your silence? Mark nodded. $50,000. A transfer. Jurors watched closely. Some seemed to believe him. Others remained skeptical. But one thing was certain. The details he provided matched the forensic findings. The DNA, the fibers, the hidden Jeep, and the money trail. By the end of his testimony, the case against David Turner had deepened. For the first time, the jury had both physical evidence and a first-hand account tying him directly to Melissa's disappearance. The judge adjourned for the day, leaving the courtroom buzzing with tension. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Headlines were already forming. Friend confesses role in cover-up. DNA ties boyfriend to Jeep. And for Melissa's family, another piece of the truth had finally surfaced. The trial moved toward its climax. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and witness accounts, it was time for closing arguments. The air inside the Larimer County courtroom was heavy, the stakes overwhelming. Nearly 20 years of unanswered questions were about to collide with a single decision. The lead prosecutor rose, his voice steady but sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about a missing person. It is about a woman who was betrayed, silenced, and hidden from her family for almost 2 decades. He walked toward the jury box, holding up a photo of Melissa in her nurse's uniform. Melissa Carter did not walk away from her life. She did not abandon her son. She was taken from both by the man who claimed to love her, David Turner. The prosecutor revisited the evidence point by point. David's DNA on the steering wheel and trunk, Melissa's blood on the driver's seat, the hidden Jeep, deliberately submerged, the $400,000 life insurance payout, Mark Reynolds' detailed confession, corroborated by forensic findings. He paused, his tone firm. You have heard the excuses. You have heard the talk of a mysterious third man. But no mystery man left his DNA on the steering wheel. No mystery man deposited $50,000 into Mark Reynolds' account. The evidence points in one direction only. To David. Mark cut a deal. He'll say anything to reduce his sentence. His story is convenient, but convenience is not truth. Finally, the lawyer turned to David, sitting rigid at the defense table. David Turner has already lost the woman he loved. Do not compound tragedy with injustice. Do not convict a man when doubt is this strong. The judge instructed the jury, then sent them to deliberate. Hours turned into a full day. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Melissa's family waited in silence, clutching each other's hands. On the second day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, tense and silent. The clerk read the decision. On the charge of second-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of insurance fraud, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to conceal a crime, guilty. David Turner sat motionless, his face drained of colors. He looked down at the defense table, avoiding the eyes of Melissa's family. Then came Mark Reynolds. On the charge of being an accessory after the fact, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. Mark's shoulders slumped. He whispered, "I'm sorry," though no one was sure who he was speaking to. Melissa's mother broke down in tears. Her son, now a young man, wrapped an arm around her. For the first time in years, their grief carried a measure of closure. In the gallery, neighbors wept openly. Reporters scribbled frantically, already framing their headlines. Justice at last in Poudre River Mystery. The prosecutor's team embraced quietly. For them, this was not just a legal victory. It was a vindication of years of persistence and the power of modern forensic science. Before adjourning, the judge addressed the courtroom. This case reminds us all, time does not erase truth. Justice delayed is still justice delivered. Today, Melissa Carter has finally been heard. As David was led out in handcuffs, he glanced once toward Melissa's family but said nothing. Mark followed soon after, his head bowed. The family remained seated, overwhelmed, but in the weeks that followed, the Carter family organized a public memorial on the banks of the Cache la Poudre River. It was the same river where Melissa's Jeep Cherokee had been hidden for nearly 18 years. This time, however, the river was no longer a place of secrecy. It became a place of remembrance. Hundreds gathered. Friends, neighbors, former colleagues from the hospital where Melissa had worked, and even strangers who had followed the case from afar came together. They carried candles and flowers. Some held photographs of Melissa smiling in her nurse's uniform. Others simply bowed their heads. As the candles lit up the cold evening, a hush fell over the crowd. The sight of people standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, holding lights against the darkness, became an image broadcast nationwide. Reporters described it as the night of light for Melissa. For the Carter family, it was a moment of closure. At the memorial, Melissa's mother stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "We waited almost 20 years, she said. Justice came late, but it came. And tonight, my daughter is no longer forgotten." Melissa's son, now a grown man in his mid-20s, addressed the crowd. His words cut through the silence. "My mother's name has been cleared. Her honor has been restored. For years I lived with questions no child should have to carry. Today I can finally breathe knowing the truth has been told." Melissa's sister also spoke. She vowed to keep fighting so that no other family would have to wait nearly 2 decades for answers. There are so many families still waiting. We cannot let cold cases be buried. We cannot let memories fade. Their words resonated far beyond Fort Collins. They became a rallying cry for justice delayed but not denied. Fort Collins was a city that prided itself on safety, community spirit, and its identity as a quiet college town. But the Melissa Carter case had left a scar. For nearly 20 years, the disappearance had hovered over the community like a shadow. Now, with the truth exposed, residents found themselves torn between relief and betrayal. Relief that justice had finally been achieved. Betrayal that someone they knew, a local business owner, a neighbor, even a breakfast companion for some, had been guilty all along. People began referring to the case as the Poudre Scar. It became a phrase whispered in classrooms, in church halls, and in news columns. It was a reminder that even in places that seemed safe, dark truths could hide. Schools began holding discussions on safety and trust. Churches incorporated Melissa's story into sermons about perseverance and faith. The local newspaper published retrospectives, reminding younger generations why Melissa's name must never be forgotten. The trial's outcome captured national attention. Newspapers from coast to coast covered it under headlines like, "Justice at Last, Colorado Cold Case Cracked by Sonar and DNA." Podcasts and television shows dedicated episodes to the case, analyzing how technology had turned an unsolved mystery into a landmark conviction. True crime programs replayed courtroom footage and memorial scenes, reminding viewers that the persistence of one family had forced authorities to keep the case alive. Editorial writers across the country reflected on the meaning of the verdict. One columnist wrote, "The Melissa Carter case proves that justice may be slow, but with persistence, truth cannot stay buried." From a legal and forensic standpoint, the Carter case became a textbook example. Law enforcement academies began using it as case study material. It highlighted the power of combining traditional police work with modern forensic breakthroughs. The sonar and underwater radar that revealed Melissa's Jeep demonstrated how technology could reach places once thought inaccessible. The DNA analysis, able to extract and match genetic profiles after nearly 2 decades underwater, showed the progress of forensic science. The state of Colorado quickly responded. Legislators approved increased funding for the Cold Case Task Force. Police departments were instructed to revisit unsolved cases with the potential for new forensic testing. Other states took notice. Several cited the Carter case while introducing their own bills to strengthen cold case resources. Even as justice was celebrated, the case exposed painful mistakes. In the early days of the investigation, crucial steps had been missed. David Turner's phone and financial records had not been seized quickly enough. His insurance payout had been allowed to slip through without immediate scrutiny. These oversights haunted investigators. They were repeated in news stories and community forums as cautionary tales. Retired detectives admitted that if those leads had been properly pursued, Melissa's family might not have had to wait 18 long years. But those failures also became lessons. Police agencies adopted stricter procedures for handling missing person cases. Prosecutors emphasized that cold cases must be periodically reviewed, especially as technology evolves. The Carter case became a reminder that giving up too early can rob families of justice. Melissa's son, once a quiet child, left to grow up with questions he couldn't answer, now found himself at the center of a movement. He began speaking publicly about what it meant to be a secondary victim, someone who loses a parent not only to violence, but also to years of uncertainty. At a criminal justice conference, he told the audience, "We lived in the shadows for nearly 20 years. But today light has reached us. That light is called justice." His voice carried weight because it came from lived pain. Other families with missing loved ones reached out to him. He became an advocate, encouraging people not to give up, reminding them that persistence can keep a case alive. The Carter family as a whole became known for their outreach. They offered support to community groups, wrote letters to legislators, and continued pressing for resources dedicated to cold case investigations. The case also inspired tangible action. In Fort Collins, a foundation was launched, the Melissa Carter Foundation. Its mission was to provide financial support for search efforts in cold cases and to offer counseling to families waiting for answers. Each year, the city began hosting an annual candlelight vigil at the river. It became a tradition, not only to honor Melissa, but also to shine a light on others who remained missing. Local universities introduced Melissa's story into their criminology and journalism courses. Students studied the case to understand both the failures and the triumphs. For Colorado, the Carter case marked a turning point. It proved that cold cases are not lost causes. Investigators, prosecutors, and lawmakers repeated a new mantra. Cold case does not mean hopeless case. Melissa's story became a symbol of truth refusing to stay hidden. Her name appeared in academic journals, law enforcement manuals, and even state Senate debates. Families across the state used her case as an example when demanding that their own loved ones' files be reopened. The Carter family, while forever scarred by loss, knew that Melissa had left behind more than grief. She had left a legacy of perseverance, one that would help others find justice in the years to come. As the lights of the annual vigil flickered across the Poudre River, one message rang clear. Melissa Carter's story must never be forgotten. Her family spoke once more, not only to their community but to everyone listening across the country. If you want us to keep telling these stories, they said, if you want us to honor victims who waited too long for justice, like, comment, and subscribe. Share their names. Keep their memory alive, because only by remembering can we ensure that justice delayed does not become justice denied. And so, the story of Melissa Carter closed not with silence, but with voices united. Voices demanding that the past be confronted, that families be heard, and that every cold case, still waiting in the dark, might one day find its light.